Hey, what's going on, guys? Gamerdude back once again with another episode in our Just the Fact series. So, first of all, I want to open this episode by saying to my entire community, I hope you're all well and keeping safe. You know, we're still all in this together, we're still very much in danger, and if you want to stay safe, even though they're not always right, please listen to your governments, or the virus just isn't going to be going away anytime soon. I would also like to pass on my deepest condolences for anyone watching in the future who may have lost a loved one or friend due to the C virus. So, on with the show. Welcome back, of course, to Just the Facts with yours truly. In this week's episode, we are going to be talking about a forgotten little gemstone which has made its way out of the shadows and into the light. Yes, that's right, it's crawled out of the shadows just like Hydra. had to get that reference in there. Anyway, but yes, as you can see from the title, if you were a fan of the series, Crysis is back. However, you may be a little disappointed. So in this episode we will be discussing why it's returned and why it's only returned for one specific platform. So buckle up, because this is going to be a long one, because during my research I found the devs had a lot to say about bringing this one back. I mean, there was 10 pages. Okay, so I'm going to shorten as much of it down as possible, but there's still a lot to go through. Anyway, yes, as I said, as you can see from the title, Crysis Remastered is coming back, but on the Switch. Now, the bigger question is, can it run Crysis? It has been 13 years since Crytek's epic-making release hit the market. I mean, I got it for free on my PS3. Don't know how I got it for free, I just remember I got it for free, and free game, so I played it and I quite enjoyed it. Even though it was first person, I still kind of enjoyed it. But in some respects, the game is still capable of monstering modern day PC hardware. But now, the game is supposedly playable on a handheld console using a mobile processor with power consumption that barely troubles a watt meter. So, just how good is the new port? How does it compare to the sub-optimal last-gen version? And can it possibly match up to the original experience on a handheld console? Much has been made of the leaked material for Crysis Remake, with negative fan reactions causing Crytek to hold the game back for a little tweaking. But they always say tweaking, but we know it's because the fans are a little bit pissed about something they may or may not have changed. However, the Nintendo Switch version arrives on the original July 23rd release date. So yeah, it's already out. Well, at the time of recording this, it's already out because I recorded this on the 22nd. So. But yeah, from the first 10 minutes of gameplay, it's easy to see why. Based on the code available and the sheer complexity of the game's build, it's difficult to imagine a port that's anything better than what we've been delivered this time around. It's not without its faults, but Crysis has been expertly retooled to scale graphically to the console hybrid and pushes Switch's ARM Cortex A57s to breaking point. I mean, I don't know much about the Nintendo Switch. I will never get a Nintendo Switch, so if you know what the A57 is, let me know. But yeah, it is apparently a remarkable, fascinating port, but not without issues, and strictly speaking, it's not even fully complete. The Ascension mission that's missing from the PS3 and Xbox 360 versions are still missing in this version. So, if anything, really, it's not really a remake, it's just the same game, ported over years later. But anyway, let's start with the basics. In taking a look at what Crytek and developer partner Saber Interactive has delivered. On Switch, Crysis Remastered, or Remade, uses dynamic resolution with temporal upscaling. Wait, temporal upscaling? Does that mean they time travelled? Was there a paradox somewhere? I don't know. That was a bad joke. Sorry, ignore that. Anyway, the pixel count suggests that 720p is the average resolution you'll experience during the gameplay, which is the norm these days. 720 is the basic standard for gaming these days. Well, unless you get a PS4 Pro, then it's 4K, but you know what I mean. You know what I mean. If you haven't got a 4K TV, then 720p is the natural way to go. In busy situations, you can count resolutions such as 540p and even lower, but this isn't especially common, especially in docked mode. The resolution of the current game they've brought back is capped at 720p in portable. Of course, but it can also jump slightly above this when docked, so charging docked, you know. Based on information I've found from the developer, the full dynamic resolution scaling range is from 520p to 900p while it's docked, dropping to 400p to 720p in mobile configuration. Where Crytek leans into the 640 MHz power GPU mode, up from the typical 384 MHz used in most Switch games. The main takeaway is that image quality isn't that bad. You know, it's about what you'd expect from a Nintendo Switch game. You know, it's not pristine, but it's significantly better than the heavily blurred presentations seen in the likes of the ID Tech 6 ports from The Witcher 3 and Warframe. There are definitely some noticeable missions or omissions to the visual feature set, but this is essentially a mobile port after all. There's a reduction in the geometry on elements like the nanosuit and elimination of ray-merged volumetric light sources and parallax occlusion mapping, but there are dramatic upgrades as well. Now, I do understand that, like the Xbox 360 and the PS3, CryEngine 3 ports are the foundation on which Crysis Remastered, or Remade, is based. But if you look at them side by side, it's clear that on the Switch version, it does look significantly better, but only in some respects. Like, in some areas of the game, it does look a little bit worse, and in some areas, it does look so much better, especially when you're looking at the visuals and backgrounds. The first major shift stems from the lighting. On the surface, there are tweaks made to the time of day compared to the original game, along with the introduction of image-based lighting, which helps with material quality. Of course, this is a relatively new technology, so it's something that can be used now, as opposed to 13 years ago. However, the most significant and surprising addition here is a sparse voxel-based global illumination known as, and I'm having to spell this out because I can't pronounce it, SVOGI. So if you guys know what that is, let me know, because I've never actually heard of that. I just came across it in my research. So essentially, if we break it all down, global illumination is typically pre-calculated or baked on most games. Yeah, they're all baked when they make the games. That if baked was in quotation marks, I'm only saying what the developers said there. So yeah, they're all clearly baked when they make the games. Anyway, so instead, SVOGI delivers a real-time global illumination system that offers both ambient occlusion and indirect light bounce, delivering a standardization of realism that easily eclipses the last gen ports and indeed the lighting found from the PC original. It is, however, surprising to see this on the Switch, but as I understand it, SVOGI is highly scalable. Because, I don't know what it is, but I did look into it, and it does look like it's rather scalable on the portable systems. But according to the team responsible for its conversion, the implementation of the systems runs at a very low resolution on the Switch, but the primary optimization work centered around optimizing data formats to reduce the size. So this is perhaps the most significant improvement. It's Crytek making good on its promise to bring high-end CryEngine features from the latest iteration of the engine back into Crysis. And it's fully armed and operational on the Switch, even when you're playing it in handheld mode. Now, beyond that, the rest of the lighting sees more subtle adjustments. There's been a couple of tweaks to the time of day which can be seen in missions very clearly, such as Assault, where the sun rises much earlier on Switch than it does on the PC version. Well, the original version on PC, that is. But in general, most changes seem designed to create a more dynamic looking game, similar to many of the mods available on the PC version. Now, once again, I don't agree with modding. If Crytek are okay with people modding their game, that is fine. However, I won't do it, because to me, modding it doesn't add to the gaming experience. Where's the fun in running around a game playing as Rick or Morty or Scooby-Doo? It's just ridiculous and pointless, and it's not needed. But anyway, before I turn this into a rant about about modding. In general, most changes seem designed to create a more dramatic looking game. More importantly, the new lighting model more closely resembles that original PC vibe, which cannot be said of the PS3 and 360 releases. The versions on the PlayStation and Xbox, they rely too heavily on let's say a strong bloom and blue tinged colour grading. Throughout, it's a cold, harsh looking game that strays too far from the original in my taste. But Crysis Remastered is a huge improvement in that sense, and the more immersive, naturally lit environment does really pop out of the screen. The entire post-processing suite has been enhanced as well. Per object and camera motion blur remains intact with a higher sample count than the previous console release. The PC version did use a different technique. It only applies motion blur to dramatic objects and camera rotations, but not player movement, so in that sense, the Switch delivers an improvement all round. The bokeh depth of field, used most notably with the iron sights on the weapons, is also really impressive. It's an improvement both over the original release and the last gen version of the game. So moving on, this is what some of the developers had to say. Another key pillar on which Crysis is founded is destruction. The idea is that the trees, the bushes and entire buildings interact and break apart based upon your actions. Harking back to an era where video games went to extraordinary lengths to deliver those realistic physics. The destruction in Crysis was a remarkably impressive element which heightened combat and enabled some amazing moments. We wanted that back on this new version. But the fact that every feature is delivered means that there are some compromises. Objects and builds on just about every scale can break apart in real time, but this does cause momentary drops to the frame rate. Thankfully, this dissipates quickly, so it's not a huge deal. They go on to say, I can't imagine Crysis without destructible buildings, so it's worth the performance hit. And despite its meager CPU resources, Switch still manages to outgun last-gen console frame rates. That I don't have a dispute with. You know, last gen we're talking 2009 to when the PS4 and Xbox One came out, so that's probably from 2009 to 2013, 2014, maybe a bit sooner. But yeah, obviously everything past that point is going to be significantly better and smoother. Now, in delivering these features on the Switch with just 3 available 1 GHz mobile cores, there are further compromises to the game. As you blast the palm trees and flowers, the branches react to every shot, but these iterations are time-sliced on the Switch, updating to a lower frame rate than the main render. As a result of this, when you unload on a tree, it appears somewhat choppy. In comparison, the PC original and even last-gen console versions of the games, these iterations were at full frame rates. However, while we're on the subject of foliage, it's good to see that density in this respect is far closer to the original PC game than rather sparse last-gen console releases. There's more grass, trees, and bushes used throughout, just as you'd hope. So that really kind of sounds like the argument that people had with Spider-Man PS4 when they removed a puddle. It's like, why is that puddle not there? You took out a puddle, you lowered the graphics resolution, but in this case they've added more, so it's like, oh, you added some bushes. Where are the puddles? I want puddles. Moving on anyway. As for the rendering of shadows, the fidelity of shadow maps is reduced compared to the PC and console versions with higher settings, as you'd expect, really, because it's a portable console. But CryEngine's method for shadow filtering saves the day here, and even distant cascades are clean and devoid of artifacting. You know, I do still love the use of the small bokeh shapes resulting from the filtering techniques that were used in the original. And this is a brilliant approach to handling lower resolution shadow maps, as it kind of lends these shadows a natural softness that is pleasing to the eye. Now, shadows from flashlights are in the game as well, but similar to the last gen versions, they are absent from the first stage for some reason. So it's like they just couldn't be bothered in the first part of the game to put any detail in whatsoever. But I do appreciate how, when using a flashlight, each beam projects a shadow from the environment and from the space of which you are standing. Now, I've already mentioned that parallax occlusion mapping is also removed on the Switch, but Crytek tells us that this was required because it took up too much power for mobile mode, but it may return as it may return at some point in a future patch, but only while the Switch is docked. So beyond that, another key change lies in water rendering. Wasn't I just talking about the puddles? Crysis Remade makes the jump to the DX11 class water simulation featured in newer versions of CryEngine, and the water surface itself is more visually pleasing to the eye as a result. So in that respect, think of The Last of Us Part 2, how they made the water look in that. Remarkably, expensive planar reflections are still in use in the world for the reflections as well. However, the rendering of underwater areas has taken a noticeable hit compared to the original versions. Basically, the rocks and plants featured beneath the ocean, they're just gone. They've taken them out completely. I mean, to be fair, it's only a visual aid. They aren't really required, but you know, it's a nice visual aid. It's something we like to see if we get to explore underwater in a game. But because of this, it's going to leave you with an empty, sandy expanse, while the water caustic layer also has and exhibits a visible cutoff line that you can see while you're swimming. But you won't necessarily spend a whole lot of time underwater in Crysis anyway, so like I was saying, it's not really required, you know, it's not really a big loss. Now, this is something coming from the developers again, and they say it's probably the most remarkable aspect of the remake. And it's that all of the impossible ports we've seen so far on Nintendo Switch, there's less of a sense that we're having to work with a vast array of technology cutbacks. Of course, part of this is down to the fact that fundamentally the game is 13 years old. So it's very old. You know, they're having to rebuild on an engine that is 13 years old. Now, while the conversion is based on 9-year-old PS3 and Xbox 360 code, but the point is that the remaster has been improved with modern cutting-edge rendering techniques, including temporal upscaling and dynamic resolution, and actual real-time global illumination, aside from the resolution drop in certain areas. The only difference between mobile and docked play is shadow map quality. And even then, the drop in fidelity in handheld mode is not that big of an issue, because I've seen the trailers for it, I've seen a bit of gameplay, and it does look alright. So all of which brings us down to the final and most crucial aspect of this analysis: the performance. Crysis is exceptionally heavy on the CPU. It was very difficult for it to render on the PS3 and Xbox 360. That is one thing a lot of players complained about, that it wasn't rendering properly, that it was crashing the systems. Thankfully, the developers did have access to last-gen console ports, which moved a game that operated mostly on a single core to leverage 6 available hardware threads, or SPUs in the case of the PS3. Regardless of this, it's still required extensive optimization on Switch to deliver the same workload using 3 CPU cores. Occlusion culling, basically removing objects that you don't see from being rendered in the first place, was a CPU task on last-gen consoles. But on Switch, it's moved to the GPU. Other tasks, because of this, have been sped up, simply by virtue of the fact the Switch has around, I think it's 3.5 gigabytes of usable memory, as opposed to the mere 512 megabytes on the PS3, well, the original PS3 and Xbox 360. God, this episode's just turned into it's just turned into something about the specs of the Nintendo Switch and PlayStation 3 and 360. So I do apologize for that, but that is what the guys over at Crytek are quoting, and I'm just reading back what they've said. So continuing on from that, hitting CPU limits does impact on performance in games. Even if you're not up on technology and whatnot, I'm sure you guys know a CPU is a big part of a gaming experience. You know, without a CPU, the console it can't function. Now, this is especially important when engaging multiple enemy AIs while putting the physics system through its paces. Unsurprisingly, this is most evident in areas where the game was always heavy on the CPU and crashed on last-gen systems. Such as the village in the second mission, for example. Oh, how I remember that one well. You can expect the frame rates to drop into the low 20s when this happens, and sometimes even lower in Crysis. when it comes to the combat scenes. But with that said, the use of motion blur and triple buffering does mitigate some of the impact, but I would hope, in my personal opinion, to see improvements from here. I remember in Mission 4, I actually noted that the game could freeze for a moment. And for me, it wasn't just a moment, because I was running a very old PS3 at the time. I had a 40 gigabyte arcade, not gigabyte. I don't think it was gigabyte. Was it gigabyte? Yeah, I think it was 40. Yeah, it was a 40 gigabyte arcade PS3 at the time. So that was one of the first PS3s they released, and it would just freeze for days on that mission. I remember it froze, and I thought, you know what? I'll leave it for a minute because I can still hear the disc spinning. I'll go downstairs, make a brew, have a bite to eat, watch a TV show, come back up, and it was still frozen. So you do have to watch out for that, because apparently it does still happen. So Crytek says this bug will be unrelated to any CPU performance, and it should be fixed in one of their patches. Emphasis on should. They put should in quotation marks, so that's probably saying it's unfixable and it's a fault in the game. But outside of the heaviest combat scenarios, Crysis actually does run rather well. Like I say, I've seen some of the gameplay, I've seen some of the trailers, it does look pretty good. Even with its enhanced feature set and real-time global illumination system, it still manages to outperform the past versions of the game. Much of the action plays out at a steady 30 frames per second, and again, performance is overall much the same whether you're playing docked or in handheld mode. Now, Crysis Remastered is CPU limited in most scenarios, and the Switch's ARM cores run at the same clocks whether you're playing docked or in mobile mode. However, even when running in optimal conditions, there is a problem. Once again, we come back to the frame rate issue, which is actually 31 frames per second, not 30 frames per second. It may sound like a matter of little importance what frame rate you're playing a game at, because you just want to enjoy the game. But it may, for the whole reason of it, the reason 30 frame rates per second is a developer choice at all is that new frames are synchronized with every other screen refresh. So is that it? I think that's all they had to say. Sorry, I had to script all of this because they just would not stop shutting up. As I said, it was about 10 pages. Okay, yeah, I wrote a little bit more here. Despite its more linear design, Crysis puts each of its maps to better use than any open world game played to date. While traversing the environments in a game such as Far Cry, most areas are ultimately just window dressing. It's like you're just window shopping, basically. They don't factor into your strategy and having little impact on the game. This is not the case with Crysis, and it's fundamentally what makes it so special. Now, honestly, this is just scratching the surface, but the point of this is Crysis itself remains a pop culture classic experience even to this day. And even with the limitations of the Switch, it's still absolutely worth checking out if you have a Nintendo Switch. So yeah, I shortened it down, otherwise we would have been here all day. But that's basically the gist of the Crysis remake. Now, as to why they've done it on the Nintendo Switch, I don't know. I mean, is the Nintendo Switch getting more popular now? Do I not know something? Have I missed something? Let me know in the comments below anyway. And also let me know if you played the original Crysis, if you'll be playing this version, if you have a Nintendo Switch, if you like the Nintendo Switch, if you bought one, played it, and then put it down. Just let me know what you think overall. Yeah, that's it for this episode, and I hope you all enjoyed it. And I hope I expanded your gaming knowledge and gave you an inside look into this remake. So, of course, shout out to all subscribers, old and new. Can't believe we've surpassed 1100 subscribers. I really can't thank you all enough for the continuous support and views of my content. I will, of course, continue to bring you the best content I can. If you are new to the channel and enjoyed this video or any of my other content, make sure you smash that like button and drop me a subscribe. I always sub back to new subscribers and view any content you may be producing. Stay tuned tomorrow because we're going to be doing a Last of Us Part 2 live stream. So can't wait to play The Last of Us again. It's been a hot minute since I played it. I left you guys on a cliffhanger. You guys know I love to leave you on cliffhangers when playing games like that, so I know you guys are looking forward to seeing it. But yeah, that being said, this has been Just the Facts with Gamerdude. Happy gaming, and I will catch you all in the next one, guys.